Welcome everyone. My name is Joanne Limburg. I'm a writer and creative writing tutor. And this is my talk. It's going to be about my own work. It's about how I, as a late diagnosed person, I expressed and constructed and processed my sense of autistic subjectivity through my work. So the question I had is, what does it mean to be an autistic writer? I know I'm a writer and I know I'm autistic, but what does it mean to be both? So I've thought of myself as a writer since childhood. It was something I always wanted to do. I published my first poetry collection at 30. So in the sense of being an author, I've been a writer for the past 21 years. But I was diagnosed as autistic 12 years later. And what I wondered from the outset was what the relationship was between these two identities, autistic person, which I acquired later in life, and writer, which I'd already had. And particularly as someone who writes about her own experience, who expresses, or you could say, who constructs her subjectivity through writing, could I then identify and then express or construct autistic experiences or autistic subjectivity through my writing? And then there was a further question, which was, now that I knew I was autistic, how might that self-knowledge inform my practice as a writer from that moment on? So one obvious answer is, well, you were already autistic. When one is autistic, one's autistic from birth. So by definition, anything I'd written was already autistic writing. And this is a quote from an essay I'm going to come back to later. I've been wondering what it would mean to write from the perspective of an autistic subject, I said. But weren't you always writing from that perspective? She asked. So that was a question a conversation I had not long after I'd been diagnosed. So there's evidence that yes, I was actually writing from that perspective. One thing I did was go back through stuff I'd already written, stuff I'd already published, and I could see in retrospect that what I was talking about was an identifiably autistic experience. So there was identifiably even autistic subjectivity there. So here's a poem I wrote in 1996, which was published in 2000. So I wrote it some years before I was diagnosed, 16 years, in fact. The would-be's. We're not yet human, but we're trying. We're taking notes, we're taking classes, we're taking medication. It can take surgery to straighten kinks as bad as ours. Sometimes it hurts. You have to suffer to be human. Sometimes we cry into our pillows. But please don't make too much of that. Our tears don't count. We're not yet human enough to satisfy the judges that we're not just apes or dummies. When they're sure, they'll let us out, and then we'll live among the humans, holding hands and pushing buggies, drinking Coke, doing the things everybody knows, everybody does. And I was writing, of course, from my sense of being a bit off compared to other people. And I was always trying, up to the point when I was diagnosed, to change myself and improve myself and correct myself. And I think this poem could also refer to the forms of correction that we're subject to as a population, such as horrible ABA, behaviour analysis, whatever it's called. Applied behaviour analysis, that's it. So my first attempt post diagnosis to write about it was an academic or a quasi-academic paper. It was in the personal reflections section of a journal called Life Writing. And its title was, "But That's Just What You Can't Do. Personal Reflections on the Construction and Management of Identity Following a Late Diagnosis of Asperger Syndrome," which is what I was diagnosed to at the time, though I tend to use autism. an autistic rather than Asperger. And the quote, "but that's just what you can't do," came from the assessor I met when I was being assessed for disabled student allowance for the PhD that I was about to do. When he was talking about how he tends to take on the accents and cadences of who he talks to, and he said, "but that's just what you can't do, isn't it? You're always just the same." And I said, "well, no, there is such a thing as echolalia. So I very much take on the cadences and accents of people I'm with." Another thing he said in that very memorable encounter was, "creative writing and Asperger's. How does that work?" I went into that interview thinking that my diagnosis would speak for itself, and that that diagnosis represented something authentic and unchanging underneath the layers of masking and compensation and socialization that were on top of it. But I came out of that realizing that my identity as an autistic person also had an element of performance and was constructed through the way I interacted with my diagnosis and through the discourse around autism, and that it needed to be performed in that particular instance where I was seeking accommodation in a way that was recognizable to the assessor. This was something I hadn't realized before. So I had been performing all my life what I saw as a more normal self, doing the things everybody says everybody does. And I'd imagined that if I scraped this away, I could reclaim a pre-masking, stable, authentic autistic self, like finding an original feature in a house underneath something that's covered it up. But I discovered instead that there are also social expectations and performative aspects to an autistic identity. And all selfhood and subjectivity is dynamic and interacts with these other expectations. And another thing I realized was that in retrospect, I had to construct not only a present autistic self, but a childhood self who existed before. And when I look back at my childhood and my childhood self, my personal history, and saw it as the history of an autistic person, as the history of a class of people to which I belonged, it looked different. And so to do this, I went, as I often do when I'm processing things, to poetry, which was the first form of writing I engaged in as an author. So I thought, how could I reconstruct this autistic earlier self creatively, sort of do this archaeology and reconstruct my story, my own narrative? So rather than through a therapeutic process, through interacting with a professional, which is another way to do it, I turned to my established practice as a poet, and I went back to one of my childhood special interests, to coin a medical term, which were Lewis Carroll's Alice books. Now, as many of you will know, Lewis Carroll is often spoken about himself as being on the spectrum. It's a horrible form of language, I'll correct that, as being possibly autistic. And also, there's something about that story of that very logical child going through this very arbitrary world that spoke to me as an autistic child. I had that curiosity, that logic, and that habit of suddenly running in to some arbitrary rule I didn't know was there and getting told off. And there's also something about Tenniel's Alice, the way she just stares very levelly at the reader, or at the other characters, that reminded me of my own expression. So I'll read some of the poems. This first one is one of my early memories, one of those memories which I later sort of recaptured as an autistic sort of memory. And I've used that third person, that finding that third person, I should say, allowed me to get the distance from that childhood experience to feel that I could manipulate it in a poem and reconstruct it in a poem. And I've borrowed, obviously the Alice name, and also the concept of an Unbirthday, which appears at the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. Alice is 3 and she knows it. She's sitting face to face with daffodils underneath the washing line, which is a roundabout for clothes. Her mother pegs some clothes up, gives them all a ride, and pegs again. Alice feels like trying something. "I'm 4, she says. "No, you're not," her mother says. "You're 3. She picks Alice up and pegs her to this rule. It isn't saying it that makes it true. Now, I have a memory of that as my little experiment with reality, and the result was speech doesn't change anything. And I remember thinking, oh, okay. This is a memory from school. And if you remember, Alice, certainly in the first book, she grows and she shrinks again, and it's distressing and very alienating. And I remembered at school getting in trouble for dyspraxia, for not following instructions, for not understanding them. And I remember feeling that my body was kind of, I still do, that I've got poor perception. I'm not quite sure where all the bits of my body are. And also that horrible feeling of being huge and exposed when everyone is looking at you on the teacher's cross. Without meaning to, or even knowing, Alice has grown huge again. It starts with her name and an angry voice. "Look what you've done." Since when were her hands so far away? One stuck on her face and covered in ink. The other's on the desk by the upended carton with milk seeping out. "Don't just look at it, pick it up." Alice does, but something's wet somewhere. "She's got it all over her skirt." Alice finds her feet and stands on them. The scrape of her chair is thunderous and rude. "Go to the office, get a change of clothes." Eyes watch her thudding dumbly to the door. The dumbest Alice lump they ever saw. And this is one from later on. If you remember from Through the Looking Glass, Alice in the course of the book crosses a chessboard as a pawn and eventually becomes a queen. And there's a picture of her putting a crown on her head. And I didn't expect to become a queen so soon. And this is a story about masking, successful masking, but also the strange sense of alienation from the self that comes from it. She did not expect to be a queen so soon, or ever, but somehow there is a crown upon her head, and Alice must act up to it. The Red Queen has left instructions. Keep washed, keep combed, wear what women like you wear, secure a partner for the dance, remember eye contact. Smile when they smile, when they look sad, look sad. Alice stands up straight. She moves her face until it feels like someone else's. Then she hits the high street, smiling, practicing her singing, queenly voice on all the shop assistants. With time, it rings less false. With years, she even fools herself. She finds a king. They claim their castle, which they decorate and fill with white goods. She births a little prince, wheels him to queenly coffee mornings, where she talks, like other queens, of kings and princes, high street clothes, holidays and in-laws, castle decoration, the purchasing and breakdown of white goods. She's done well. People meet a queenly face and think it's really hers, and after so long she thinks they might be right and wonders if she only dreamed that other awkward one. But if she did, who's in the looking glass? Whose is that unsmiling, sideways stare? And this last one came from my thinking, well, what has always been the same about me, and what can I recognise as being me? And somehow resistant to all this sort of these socially dynamic processes. And then I thought of ants and how happy it made me to see ants in the summer. And I thought about what you might call autistic joy. And this is called Alice's antism. Ground is home to her. It's where her gaze can come to rest. Take stock of what has never changed. The rainbows in the gutter, the points and circles of the pouring rain, the pavement's long squared shoulder. And every summer the ants turn up, shiny black and perfectly themselves, bringing out the ant-shaped joy by which she knows she's Alice still. It occurs to me reading that while one's relationship with the human world and one's relational self changes, there's something perhaps about the way we relate to the non-human world that's unchanged. So after Alice, after the poems, I had a stint of explaining myself to the non-autistic world. This is an essay I've quoted from before, the one where I was talking to someone who said, "Weren't you always autistic?" So if you look at the shape of this essay, you can see there's a very, very tiny amount of main text, just a tiny amount, and most of it is footnotes and footnotes on the footnotes. And what I wanted to express with that shape was how difficult it is to get autistic subjectivity into the shapes of conventional expression, and also just a proliferation of thoughts that you can get when, as an autistic person, you look at a problem, all these details in all these directions pop out. And I wanted to express that visually. And also to say that one of the characteristics I feel I have as an autistic writer, and that links to my poetry, is that I have counterintuitively a non-verbal relationship with language. I like its physical qualities, its look on the page and its sound. And then I had to explain in more conventional ways. I had an essay in an anthology called Others, and The Guardian in July 2019, when the book came out, asked me to write a version for their paper, and that was the headline. "I knew people found me uncanny and strange, then came a diagnosis that explained it all." And in it, I was talking about how it feels to be exhibited as other, while, as you can see in the photograph, there's a woman, there's me with white woman with glasses sitting in her back garden, looking very unsmiling. I hate that picture, but I made the mistake of saying to the photographer that I always felt I had to smile, and he said, "Don't then." But I find that picture quite difficult to look at for a lot of reasons. And then the editor of the Observer magazine asked me to respond to Greta Thunberg's remarks that autism could be a superpower in some cases. And they found a nicer smiley picture of me still in the garden from another interview. And I found that very difficult to write. It was a conventional journalism article, which I don't really do. And I had to sort of explain the non-autistic side of things more than I wanted to and interview other people. And I found that very difficult and thought, never again. So this brings me to my latest project. And I thought about the difference between writing to non-autistic people and writing to us. I thought about how in some Black culture, for example, Beyonce's album Lemonade, it was made for other Black women, and we could listen if we wanted to, but it wasn't made for us. And that was a big difference. She wasn't doing it to entertain the wider white world. And so I decided that I would literally write letters to other autistic women, which non-autistic people could read if they liked. And I would look at the relationship between autism, femininity and feminism and history in that book. So I would be writing not just about myself, but working towards the construction of a collected history and a shared identity. So it's not just the dynamic subjectivity of the world around us, but the intersubjectivity between me and other women's writings, because it was in autobiographies by autistic women that I finally recognized myself. And this book is coming out soon, and I hope it does speak to other autistic women, and non-autistic people can listen if they like and find out a bit about collective autistic subjectivity, which I hope that we're again constructing through this festival. Thank you very much for having me, and here are the references and here are my contact details. Thank you very much.